the organizers for inviting me to present on that topic. Proto-Bantu word order. It's a very broad topic, so I had to narrow it down to what I can do, and also I narrowed it down to what is most interesting to me, what I know best based on my own research, which is like the sentential clausal level. And so the subtitle is pre-stem object markers and the verb subject word order in Bantu and Proto-Bantu. Okay, so this is just a quick overview of the structure of the talk, and I will first start with a short introduction. So, as you know, Bantu is largely SVO, so I've worked on Bassa for many years. I've been working on Bassa, and so I knew something about like South and East Bantu languages, and then suddenly I started working on Bassa and didn't look like what I knew from these other languages. So what I will just say here is that, in a way, the word order is more flexible, more information structure based in the East and South, and at least in the Northwest, at least in my experience of the Northwest, it's not as much. And in Bassa, for instance, it's pretty rigid. Widespread phenomenon in Bantu languages is subject inversion. And so I've recently contributed a chapter on subject inversion for the handbook that is in preparation. And there were also other publications, recent ones with a lot of data. And what you see from, for instance, from the paper from Lutz and Janneke is that it's a pretty widespread phenomenon, right? Like, so you find it in from Bantu B to S. So I think there are 46 languages in the sample that they cover. So very few A. I think Bassa is the only A language, if I remember. So there might be inversion in Bantu A. We just might not have the data yet, but at least you don't find it in Bassa Bantu A. And so what you see is that you have different types of subject inversions, like for locative, instrument, patient, and so on. That the motivation seems to be mainly information structural. So here we are talking about inversion in simple sentences, right? Like so just main clauses, simple sentences. And so the motivation for it seems to be either to detopicalize a subject or to focus a subject, depending on the language. And as I said, it's something that is like very Bantu in a way, but if you look at Bassa, you don't find it at all. So now what happens in more complex sentences, and here I was interested in relative clauses because I knew from what I had read that you had several patterns in relative clauses in terms of like where the subject is. But my feeling from like writing this handbook chapter was that there is not much on the topic like recently published and so on. And so I looked at various publications, like I also used like Mark the work by Msuka and Kutsi from 82, and it is excellent. And more recently there is this book by edited by Gracien and Rebecca, and there was also a Tsaspil edited by Laura and colleagues a few years ago. So that together is a lot of data. It's a lot of data from many groups, and also from grass-field Bantu. So if I summarize what you find in relative clauses, some of them have the SV word order, some of them have the VS word order, and some of them have both SV and VS. So, and I chose to focus on word order in relative clauses. Why? Because I knew that there are two talks coming, Janneke and Yukiko, who are going to talk about information structure. So I thought, okay, is there a way to kind of focus on word order without talking about information structure much? So I tried, of course, at some point I'm going to come back to information structure, but at least there was this idea that, so I know it's not, I mean, probably Tom, you have, I know some people have tried to show, for instance, Ines, that you can have some expression of information structure in embedded clauses. So I'm not saying that you never have anything to do with information structure in embedded clauses, but at least there's this idea that relative clauses are not used to convey the main assertion, so they are usually not the place where you are going to, have a topic and a focus and so on. And so that was the idea there. So it's like, in a way, by looking at what's going on in relative clauses, you can kind of see like morphosyntactic constraints and not so much information structure. And so the question was, so how are the various patterns I talked about, like SV, VS, and SVVS, distributed over the various Bantu zones and group, and is there any consistency? And in a way, Tsuka already gives us some information about that, but I think that now we have much more information, so I try to add. And so the general question was, can we determine which order, so in relative clauses, characterized Proto-Bantu relative clauses? So yeah, okay, so here is my sample. So with the data that from the various books and publications I've just read, I could get 150 narrow Bantu languages. So they mostly come from Tsukara, and I added 43 languages. Then I wanted to have, so here I followed, I think it's Derek Nurse's, one of your paper, I don't see you, you are there, like one of the papers where you, so I'm not a historical comparative linguist, so I kind of like, before starting this work, I kind of like looked at what was already there and what was the methodology. And so it seemed it was important to also look, it made sense to look also above Bantu, right? So I looked at a few, so just a peek, a few Bantuid languages and a few so non-Bantuid, non-Bantu Niger-Congo languages. And so here is so here I give you, so that's a graph that shows like the language represented in each Bantu zone. And so actually I rechecked after talking with Mark yesterday. So in Tsuka's work, you had 18 C languages, and for all the other groups where you have most languages right now, you had only 9. So meaning that already in his sample, Bantu C was slightly overrepresented, which I think is kind of important. So I've added 4 C languages, and I've added 11 A languages, and I've added 5 S languages, and so on. So they are now, it's not perfect as you see, but somehow C languages are not as much overrepresented as they were originally. Okay, so here I'm just giving you a list like of the languages that I have access to. If you notice errors in the codes, it's possible because I consulted various sources, and sometimes the sources vary as to how the languages were classified, but I hope that overall I'm not too far away from what is agreed today. Okay, so that's just a quick look, and so for the Benue Congo outside Narrow Bantu, I had these languages, mostly from the book by Rebecca, edited by Rebecca and Gracien, and then I have these Niger Congo languages from various sources. Okay, and so according to the sources I accessed, my Narrow Bantu sample has 63 languages with SV only word order, 72 languages with VS only word order, 14 languages with both SV and VS. But here I'm saying at least, because I can imagine that some of the sources did not mention the variation, right? That the 2 options were possible. So this is probably, like, there are probably more languages in this group, I guess. And then I have one odd language, Nzadi, from the paper by Larry, which has this SVS word order, but I would treat, as you said, that the S seemed like to be the real subject. I treat this language as VS. So in the stats that follow, it's treated as VS. So as you see, it's like, so in my sample too, VS is the most common word order, so which is consistent with what Tsuka had shown or said in 1982. But to me, what's important is that SV is not that far behind, right? It's like, it's 150 languages. I mean, it's like we are not, the difference is not dramatic between the two groups. And you have SV in all my A languages, so it was 20, I think. All non-Bantu Benue Congo languages have SV as well, and 8 out of 9 Niger Congo languages have SV. And then I had a question mark here. Maybe someone, maybe Guillaume, you can say something to me afterwards. Or I'm not sure. I wasn't sure whether it has SV. Okay, so here is a. Okay, I'll ask you the question after the talk. So here you see how these types are distributed over the various groups. So what you see, so green is SV, purple is VS, and the orange like is a SVVS. Okay, so you can see, for instance, that A languages only have SV order in relative clauses, and you can see that most of the other groups have some VS, some SV, and some have SVVS. And as I said, this color should probably appear much more because some sources might not have reported both forms, several possibilities. And I already know, so I have a few question marks in my database. And so some groups like GD, GE, which only have green right now, so SV, it's probably because the groups are small in the first place. So I can't see all the possibilities that the group offers. But at least in Bantu A, out of 20, you have 20 SV. And there is also a lot of SV in the S group.
Green is SV?
Yeah. Sorry? Green is SV. Green is SV. Okay, so actually it was fun to prepare this talk, and at some point I even had to got to do colors by number task. So this map, I'm very grateful to Thilo. So that's from a project. That's what I read online called Seabold. And so the good thing is that Paint recognizes the borders between groups and between zones. And so I did that. And so here I'm showing you. So green is SV again, purple is VS, and the red here is not SVVS in the same language, but it's just SVVS in the same group. Okay, because Paint does not recognize the different, smaller than the groups. So I had to give one color to each group, and so that's what I have. So my map is incomplete, but yeah. So you have an idea here, and at least what I see is that you have SV and VS pretty much everywhere, except maybe for zone A again, where you have 20 languages which only have SV. Okay, so that's the summary. So, I call it gross. En gros, so we have both SV and VS are widespread, with possibly different syntactic derivations for SV. So I'm not saying that SV in A and SV in S is derived in the same way, right? But I'm just saying that in both cases, you do have languages in which, in the relative clause, the S precedes the verb. And zone A is uniformly SV so far with 20 languages. So again, it's not that much, but it's a bit more reliable than the other groups. And the individual languages that have both SV and VS are, so the ones for which I found data and are given without a question mark. And the ones for which there is a question mark is at some point I saw that it was mentioned in the sources that they had both options, but I wasn't sure enough to include them. But you might know something about that, so let me know if you recognize one of your languages there, which is either in the not included or should be included. Okay, so why is there this disease? So to me, the question is why is there a difference between these languages? So why do certain languages have VS and some have SV? And if you look at the literature, what you find is at least two proposals. So there is a proposal that Mark actually talked about earlier, which is that this idea that the nature of the relativizer determines the distribution of the subject indirectly by potentially, in their case, moving the verb towards the relativizer. And there is this other proposal by Tsuka, which is that maybe the VS order in relative clauses has its source in VS order in simple sentences with an emphatic subject. So this is a brief summary of the Denius and Hartford's proposal. So based mainly on contrast between some S languages and contrasts internal to Swahili, what they say is that some relativizers might trigger verb movement over the lexical subject. So here we have a movement of the verb towards the right. So it's not the subject put after the verb, but rather the verb moves toward the relativizer. And so what they say is that in accordance with work by Divon, that there might be morphophonological constraints at the level of the relativizer that motivates actually the movement of the verb and this VS word order. Okay, so actually my sample confirms that at least in some languages there might be something special about relative clauses that forces VS order. So what I did was I used the work by Lutz and by Jennecke, and so we have 37 overlapping languages. And so out of these 37 languages, you do have some that have VS only in relative clauses, and you have those who have VS only in main clauses and not in relative clauses. Yeah. And so, meaning here you have a double dissociation. So you can have VS in embedded clauses and not in main sentences, and you can have the opposite. So, meaning there must be, or there could be something indeed in some languages, and that would be then the one in the first group that they don't have VS and have it. Yeah. So in the first group, you might have something at least. So this is not an exhaustive list, of course. It's just based on the overlap between my sample and your sample. So it's incomplete, of course. So but at least it gives us the idea that the two things do not necessarily go together, like main and embedded sentences. Okay. Then going back to Nsuka's idea that maybe VS in relative clauses finds its base in simple sentences, I looked at languages that had both, so had it both in main and relative clauses, and you have this list here, which have, so some languages have it in both. And then I was interested, so in the last possible, in the fourth possible correlation, which was which are the languages that have neither VS in relative clauses nor in simple sentences. And this one, unfortunately, is harder to check because actually in Janneke and Lutz's sample, there's only 4 Northwest languages. And so, and in my sample, there are 23 out of my 63 languages with SV are actually found in A, B, and C. Okay, so that here the correlation could not. But okay, we have a few languages though in our samples that have neither. So that would be those languages, but there must be more. Okay, so to summarize the relation between relative and simple sentences, so the word order here. So what you can see is that so you do find VS in both main and relative and embedded, or you get what is written, right? It's like, so ultimately what you can draw as a conclusion is that you cannot actually predict the word order of relative clauses only based from simple sentences, because then you would have approximately 30% chance of being wrong. Okay, so now I go back to my main questions, which are, okay, considering that typical Bantu word order, at least in present-day Bantu, is flexible, why do certain languages have VS neither in relative clauses nor in simple sentences like Bassa? So here I'm going back to kind of one of my original questions after having showed you like what I get generally from the data. And so, so the question for us, I guess, is how flexible or rigid was PB word order, and what can relative clauses tell us about that? So here I made 2 hypotheses. So what I did was, okay, imagine Proto-Bantu was pretty much like what we see in zone A, which is it had SV relative clauses, meaning like a more rigid word order. So the idea would be, if this is the case, then zone A, present day zone A, or at least what I can see of zone A, which is consistent with Bassa pretty much, has conservative languages. But I read the literature and I know that there are debates and so what the literature seemed to indicate, and I was pretty convinced, is that this hypothesis is unlikely for more general morphosyntactic reasons. And when I see how Bassa works on a morphosyntactic level, I can see that I can imagine how you would get from like east to Bassa, but it's hard to see how a language would start from Bassa and go like to what you see in the east. I'm also talking about the distribution of certain morphemes and so on. So okay, so I thought this is unlikely. So for me, the only other hypothesis to consider is that Proto-Bantu had both SV and VS. Okay, it's not like did it have SV, it have VS, and it have both. No, for me it's like most Bantu languages are SVO, and except for Tunen, but it's like still it's like they are SV. So why would you have like SV everywhere in main clauses and VS everywhere in relative clauses, right? So what I thought was, well, maybe Proto-Bantu was like French. It had both. So it was like, so, and in that case, if Proto-Bantu had both, then zone A is innovative. And that fits with some of the ideas in terms of morphosyntax. So I don't know why zone A behaves like that. Maybe it's contact with Bantoid. But so yeah, so I follow this hypothesis. So here there's a small bit about Tsuka's work, so I re-examined it again with Mark yesterday. So it's unclear for me what he says, but he focuses, as he finds more VS, he focuses on the relation between VS and SV, and how do you go from VS to SV. So it kind of gives the idea that for him, VS was the base, but it's not so clear, so I don't want to necessarily like insist on the fact that he proposed that VS was first, but okay, so that's just, I mean, if you understood something else from his work, thank you, we can discuss it. Okay, so if Proto-Bantu was both SV and VS in relative clauses, then Bantu A has lost flexibility of word order over time. And so then I ask myself, so how can word order generally be flexible, right? So what you find across languages is some languages have case markers, some languages have what you guys, Mark and I think Larry, call morphosyntactic flagging. I'm sorry I hadn't seen this expression before, but now I integrated it. And some languages are head marking. And so the Bantu languages are known for being head marking, and so this made me think, yeah, they are, but is Bassa head marking? Is it considered head marking? Does it mark, I mean, at least it's less, and so I came to this proposal, which was, okay, the loss of VS in Northwest Bantu is related to the loss of pre-stem object markers. And so that would be consistent with like the erosion, like morphosyntactic erosion. So the idea that I'm defending is if you lose this guy, like the infix of Meusen, you lose a certain amount of flexibility in word order. And so just a quick reminder, it's a small parenthesis, but so Bantu has, like present-day Bantu has SOV, but as Martin argued, it's an innovation. So the idea that I think it's pretty consensual, how do you say, that Bantu had VO. I guess the question is whether it also had some OV when there was an auxiliary, but that to me is secondary. Okay, so we'll say that with a simple verb, Pro-Bantu was VO. And but still, if you look at Meusen's work, there is this infix, and so if PV had a pre-stem object marker, well, the OV order was found in the grammar of the language, right? It's like, so you had OV. Yeah, if you have a pre-stem object marker, it means in your own language you have structures in which an object precedes a verb, just like in French with the object predicts, right? So it doesn't matter if it had lexical preverbal objects, it already had OV. Okay, so now if we think of the morphophonological erosion, if we believe in that, and if we believe that there was like some process of going from some sort of synthetic Bantu to more analytic Bantu, then we would have the present-day consequences that we observe, which is the loss of the pre-stem OM marker, so many languages have lost this guy. Then there would be a retention or creation of post-verbal pronouns. So here I put a question mark because I don't know much about, like I talked with Larry yesterday about how you create pronouns, but so I leave this question open whether there were already like object pronouns in Proto-Bantu or whether we created them afterwards. I don't know. But so the idea is that somehow substitutive, they take the place of the pre-stem object marker. And then Tom talks about this idea of a strong object and a weak object opposition in the language. And so if you lose the weak one, then this opposition is gone. And so what I propose as consequences is that, well, when you lose the pre-stem object marker, you lose the connection between what's post-verbal is strong and what's strong is focused. Okay? So that's an important thing. And that's, in a way, for you, Janneke, is one of my insights that you can probably cite and build on for PV focus. But so the idea is, here, if you lose, so you have a pair, okay? A weak preverbal object and a strong post-verbal object. If you lose the weak one, then you neutralize the contrast, and so you have a post-verbal object that can do both. It's like, it's just, depending on the context, it's either weak or strong, and then in terms of information structure, so it can be focused and it can be not focused. Think of English, that's what you have in English, right? And Bassa to me is very much like English. Okay, so if you lose this association and if you don't have a pre-stem object marker, what you do is in a way, you lose in terms of head marking ability, in terms of word order flexibility, and what you do is you start associating a specific role with a certain position. So that's what Noonan calls indirect role marking syntax, which means you need a rigid word order. Every position is associated with a grammatical role. That's what you have in Basa. And so suddenly, if you start doing that, then naturally you lose the VS, because if you have only VO in your language, and sometimes you start generating VS, you have a problem, because suddenly you have no way of distinguishing between an O and an S, because you have, so my pronouns in Basa, they are the same as subject marker and object marker. There's nothing morphologically, nothing distinguishes subject markers and object markers. I'm talking about the pronouns. And you can only rely on the agreement, on the subject agreement. But the issue is in Basa, you subject agree with what's before the verb. Okay? And so if suddenly you move your subject after the verb, what is left to agree with is the relative, like the antecedent, like the relative head, right? So, and I will show you examples, like that's going to come, but so the idea, thank you. So the idea is that, yeah, you have two noun, you can potentially have two noun phrases after the verb, and nothing says what their role or their grammatical function is. Okay, so my prediction is very specific. It's if a language has VS, it must have the pre-stem object marker. Okay, so I started from that. If a language has VS, it must have the object marker. So I'm making it clear because that can be ambiguous, that is not. So what I say is pre-stem OM is compatible with both SV, VS, and SVVS, meaning you have a potential for flexibility, but you don't have to change your subject, okay? So you can have an OM and SV, that's fine. You don't have to use all the possibilities that are offered to you. But if you have VO, then you are compatible only with SV, not VS, and not SV, VS either, okay? So the main claim is once you start having VO, you lose some flexibility, and the SV order, at least in Bantu, and the most convenient word order in a way, or the less ambiguous word order, is to have SV. So here I schematize like the potential for ambiguity, and what is important to me is ambiguity in argument structure. We're not talking about just any kind of ambiguity, because of course languages are ambiguous, right? But they are not equally ambiguous in all areas. And so the idea is that, okay, here you have to remember, at least in the language I'm talking about, you have so here you have a relative head, an antécédent, with a certain noun class. And so, as I said, here it's important that the agreement does not operate freely. It's like you agree with what like sequence precedes the verb. And so in this order, like if you have V, so if you have VS and potentially O here, you end up having a V that agrees with this guy, and so you have nothing that indicates that this is a subject or this is an object, okay? Unless your language is a VSO order language, but it's not the case for the languages we are talking about here. So if you have this here, you have an object, so this here means it's the object marker on the verb, okay? So here, if you change the word order, the object belongs in the verb, so you know that this guy is the object here, and so the subject is kind of easier to identify. And here you have the Basa type, which is SVO, and the V agrees with the S. Okay, so that I included that just in case someone would say, no, but languages are ambiguous, you have like ambiguity everywhere and so on. And so here the idea is that, yeah, ambiguity with respect to who did what to whom does occur, despite suggestions to the contrary in the literature. There is nevertheless a correct insight underlying the suggestions. To the best of my knowledge, all languages have grammatical mechanisms, usually word order, case, marking, or agreement, to indicate argument structure. Also, it is possible to construct sentences that are ambiguous with respect to argument structure. Such examples are the exception rather than the rule. In contrast, grammars do not routinely provide mechanisms to avoid other structural ambiguities. Hence, ambiguities with respect to argument structure are much less common than some other kind. Okay, so to test what I just said, this correlation between the object marker and the word order, I went and I looked in the literature for object marking information. And so in this graph, the blue color refers to languages with VO, the yellow color refers to languages with OV, and the brown color refers to languages that have both OV, VO, okay? And so, meaning they have the two possibilities. It doesn't matter if they are in a complementary distribution or if they have to appear. It's just in the language, you have a slot for an infix and you have a post-verbal, either a suffix on the verb or a post-verbal like pronoun like you have in Bassa. Okay, and again, as you see, the VO type is somewhere in the northwest, okay? So it's not the only type. Of course, you have A languages with OV, and you even have A languages with OV-VO, but that's not a problem for me so far because I said when you have OV, you can do everything. It's just when you have VO that suddenly you lose possibilities. Okay, so here I show you the correlation. So here, so green is SV. So here you see in the colors here, you see the word order in the relative clause. And so green is still, green is SV, purple is VS, and orange is SVVS. And at the bottom you see, so those are the VO languages only, those are the OV languages, I'm talking about object marker here, and those are the OVVO, okay? Thank you, I need a few more minutes, sorry. So, so here what you see is like for my 145 languages, for which I found information. So the languages for which I don't have the information are listed at the bottom. And what you see here is that, okay, so we know most languages are OV, right? We know most languages are OV. Some of them have VO, and some of them have OVVO. And so what we know is that most languages have the VS order in relative clauses. And we know that many languages that have OV also have the SV order, right? That's the S languages, and there are many languages that have both OV and SV, and that's absolutely fine, okay? So that's consistent with what I said. What we see here, what's interesting, is that the relation is inverted. So, meaning when you get to the VO languages, actually the most common type in my sample is the SV order, and it's not the OV order. Okay, so that contradicts the usual, the general picture that we saw at the beginning. And what you see as well is that when you have VO, you do not have SVVS. So maybe there are languages that are like that. I'm not excluding the possibility, but at least they don't belong to my 145 language. Or they were not reported in my sources as having both SV and VS. Okay, so I've drawn this graph just to show you, if I zoom on the A, B, C languages, here you can see that the relation is inverted. So when you have VO, when you have a post-verbal object marker type pronoun, you tend to have SV in your relative clauses, and when you have the OV, you have more VS, but you also have some flexibility and some SV. Okay, so I mean, ideally we would like to have 100 languages here, right? Like, I know the numbers are small here, it just shows a tendency. So I think that's work for the future, right? So if we can add, we'll maybe have a different view, but so far it's consistent. Okay, so that's a summary of what I just said. Word order flexibility, meaning SVVS in the same language, is only found if that language has OV. And my prediction is borne out. VS is less common than SV in languages with VO. And it's even clearer when we only look at Northwest Bantu. Okay, but VS plus VO languages do exist, and that at the beginning was kind of an issue. It's like, why would they ever do that? You know, it's like, why would that work? Okay, and so what you find in this paper on Boshi is that you do have these kind of relatives, and of course they are ambiguous, right? So here the relative can mean either the elephant that killed the hunter or the elephant that the hunter killed, because here you have a post-verbal subject and you have nothing that identifies this guy because the relative agrees with the head. Okay, so but when they wrote the paper, so it's Jean-Marc and Martial and Annie, so what they reported is also that Boshi has an auxiliary structure, which Mark told me is common, where the order is fixed. So what you do is to fix the ambiguity, you use an auxiliary structure in which you have a rigid word order. And word order, again, disambiguates argument structure. And the other case was a recent paper, like so the other case I had access to, so Orungu is also one of these odd languages in my view, which has both VS and VO in the language. And so Marc and Odette, they talk about Orungu and they talk about the fact that so in basic relative clauses you have the same ambiguity. So in a typical relative clause, nothing identifies the subject. But the language has an interesting thing, which is what they do is they use a O construction. So it's a relative clause where you have like the morphology of a passive sentence. And you have this no, which normally flags an agent. And so the thing is, whenever you have, you relativize a human theme, you do use this structure. And in my view, the idea is what you do here is, as there is nothing, neither word order that clearly indicates the grammatical functions, no agreement, what you do is, well, you introduce some sort of preposition that tells you this guy is the agent of this verb. Voilà. Okay, so what I've observed, my sample confirms that VS is the most frequent word order. SV is, however, not that far behind and as widespread. There is a double dissociation between VS in simple sentences and in relative clauses, which is consistent with what other people have claimed. The order in simple sentences cannot, however, accurately be predicted. Accurately predict the order in relative clauses. So what I propose is that Proto-Bantu probably had both SV and VS in relative clauses, and that the loss of VS in present-day Bantu A is related to the loss of the Christem object marker. So the loss of OMV led to a general loss of flexibility in word order, as well as the loss of the association between IAV and focus. You can try to avoid information structure, but you're always pulled back. And so in my case, now I have an explanation for why Bassa doesn't have this association between IAV and focus. And so the loss or avoidance of VS in relative clauses is related to its indistinguishability from VO, partly due to verbs agreeing with the relativized noun rather than the subject. So what I predicted was if a language has VS, it must have the Christem object marker, as the combination VS plus VO creates an argument structure ambiguity in absence of head marking and or of morphosyntactic flagging. And so I tested this prediction, and what I found was that SV is more common than VS among languages with no Christem OM. And what is interesting is that the languages that still have VS plus VO, and I don't know if it's some sort of transition, I'm not sure. So they have VS and VO, they have ambiguous relative clauses, and what they do is they resort to alternative structures with village order or flagging to obviate. Okay, that's a bit complex, but so the idea was that they have other ways of clarifying the argument structure. Thank you.
Yeah, this was really fascinating. Thanks. I'm wondering how does this, how would you fit in relativized structures of things other than objects? You know, like the day that arrived my friends, and things like that, where there's no chance of ambiguity. Would you expect them to be, they play no role in this, or would you expect them to be, that to be more common because it's not ambiguous? I'm just curious because you based everything on the object.
Yeah.
You know, and that's not, that seems more basic, obviously, but are these other kinds of things irrelevant in the story, I wonder?
They're not irrelevant, it's just I didn't have time to go that far. So the thing is, it's a very good question. I have to think about it, I have to see more data. So I don't know, I'm kind of answering this basic question of why you would want to avoid inverting a subject, or why you can do it. And to be honest, I haven't thought about what you are asking, Larry, so I have to...
You can even get both the subject and the object.
Yeah, I know, and so I guess it makes for a more complex equation, and right now I cannot answer this question, but I will think about it. Thank you.
Yeah, I have a methodological question. So
yeah.
When you say something is a subject, what do you go by? If you have sentences like, which in Bantu, some Bantu languages have in the main clause, the book reads Peter, so unmarked passives, and constructions, and this construction is actually much more frequent in relative clauses, especially in zone Z, for instance. So, what's your subject? Okay. The semantic role, or you know, so that's
yeah. So I mean, so as I said, it's like I use the data from like Nusuka, Tutsi, and so from the from grammars, from papers, and so I guess usually we I mean so yeah, so whenever you had I guess most examples are have a transitive verb, and so the subject would be the agent or the experiencer or like some highly ranked role, and so
in a main clause,
in a main
that's your subject then. The book reads
no,
Peter. Peter
not.
is your
Is
your subject.
I mean, it's
but that's the logic.
No, it's not. So we are talking about two different things here. I'm not. So the thing is, the book reads Peter is not really considered the canonical sentence, right? It's like everyone agrees that something happened either at the level of information structure or at the level of voice to kind of like disturb the default alignment between thematic roles and the grammatical functions. So those examples, the book reads Peter, are probably for main sentences. They are not represented here.
In Shona, you have the sadza which eats the child. This is the exact relativization of a sentence like the book reads Peter, and
but that's the VS. That's the VS order, because the thing is that
because the verb agreement is with the head and peak. That's it's clearly an you can say it's an active clause.
But in Shona you have double agreement, right?
No. Well, Shona relative clause are much more complex, and you have there are literally sentences the sadza which eats the child, and the agreement on the verb is with the head noun. Yeah, so it's exactly like the book reads Peter.
Okay, I mean that's an individual language, and I see that there is a question here, but I don't think it necessarily weakens like what I showed, or like questions the overall methodology term, right? Like I mean, what do people do in grammars when they describe main sentences and relative clauses, right? I guess that's the question we have to address to everyone who does description here. How do they solve these issues? And I guess what I did was I assumed that they used the highest thematic role, and there is an issue in the sense that in some languages something else than this highest thematic role precedes the verb. Often it goes together. Most often it's like something else, like the object precedes, like whatever, the patient or the theme precedes the verb, and then it happens to agree with it, and so you want to call it the subject. But I mean, you know.
I was.
Any other questions?
Yeah. I thoroughly enjoyed your story, but there's a tiny detail that bothers me a bit. Because when you talked about the ambiguity, it was crucial that in Bassa, the subject is pronoun is identical to the object pronoun.
Yeah.
And there are other, as far as I know, I think there are other languages in Zone A where those two pronouns are different, and you wouldn't have the ambiguity anymore as a trigger.
Yeah, you're right. So that's something I have to consider. So I think I also have to take into account a number of things that Mark said this morning. So I've tried to generalize based on like the variables I showed you, which is like the order, like SV, and the O, the object marker or pronoun. But you're right that within each of these languages, so I know many Bantu A languages do not actually have the post-verbal pronoun like Bassa, and as you said, that's something else I have to consider to look into more detail. Now I wanted to give you an overall, what I did is give you an overall picture, and I put forward a proposal that can be tested and can potentially be falsified, right? It's
Absolutely.
like there is nothing.
One more question. Mark or Tilo?
You started out by quote, interesting, but that one should look in the relative clause, right, for basic word. Okay, and that you accepted this. Is there a test at the end whether this is a safe procedure to do?
You mean to assume that there is no information structure?
In the end, your conclusion is not about the relative clause, but about the word order.
Yeah, because as I said, it's like.
But is there another test for that?
For what exactly? For the quote at the beginning?
Yeah.
Okay, so the idea in the beginning is that that's the quote. So it's not a quote. It's my words, but actually it's supported by a number of works that are already published, right? It's nothing I've made up here. It's something that exists outside of me, and I do. So I say it's like I do. I gave précaution oratoire. I said I know of some works that try to show, for instance, Ines Fiedler's work tries to show that information structure can play a role in embedded sentences, in embedded clauses, but I said maybe in embedded clauses, information structure has a lesser role. And here, I mean, in a way, what I'm offering to you guys is that Proto-Bantu was pretty much like French, right? Like so which is funny because I'm French myself, but I'm convinced that it's like I showed you my logic, right? So and in French you can have Thilo, both DS and SV in standard French, and there is not, so the relativizer doesn't change nature, and the relativizer is the same as in other Romance languages, right? And in Portuguese, for instance, you cannot have VS, and there is nothing, I think, I mean, I thought about it, and there is nothing to my knowledge that would relate VS or SV in French relatives to the information structure. So there are counter arguments to that, but I think it's still pretty safe to assume that. So that's what I would say about that. Sorry.
Okay. Yeah, with this French substrate in Proto-Bantu.
I didn't say substrate. I didn't say typologically.
So our next speakers are Yukiko Morimoto and Nobuko Yoneda on Proto-Bantu subject and topic.